And I'd like to hand the floor to the defense counsel for Noon Jia to continue putting further questions to the expert. You may proceed, counsel. Please hold on then. Deputy Co-Prosecutor, you have the floor.
Good morning, Mr. President, Your Honours. Perhaps it's just a point of clarification, and I think my friend will probably follow it up this morning. But when we left the proceedings yesterday, he referred to a speech by the late King Father Sihanouk, and we asked for the ERN number or the document number, and that was E3/7335. And the purpose of that was to show that he used the word yuan in his speech. I've looked through the speech last night and can't find it, so I'm just wondering whether counsel can provide an ERN number of the page in which the late King Father Norodom Sihanouk used that word.
Good morning, Mr. President. Good morning, Your Honours. Good morning, Council. Obviously, I will get back to late King Father's speech before the Security Council. He doesn't say the word "yun." I never implied or said that he actually used that word. I believe there is audio, visual recordings available on the case file. He actually speaks French. He speaks French while addressing the Security Council. So I never said yesterday that he used the word "yun." The reason I talked about the speech was because Mr. Hinton referred to the combination of land swallowing and yun or Vietnamese together. That would be derogatory. So that's why I was using that example. But I will get back to that. Just to be clear, he doesn't use the word "yun" because he speaks in French. Mr. President,
Thank you, counsel, and I'd like to hand the floor to Judge Laverne.
Oui, Maître Copé, vous avez...
Yes, Mr. Kope, you are right. The original language used by King Sihanouk in his speeches is French, and I've indeed asked for the ITU to obtain the French version of that document for it to be tendered into evidence, because as of now, that document is not on record.
And just to be very clear on this, in the transcript, the draft transcript from yesterday, I'm saying literally, if the late King Father Sihanouk, while addressing the Security Council on 79 January, talks about the land-swallowing Vietnamese, is he, in your opinion, therefore racist when it comes to his views on Vietnamese? So I never implied that he said the word "yun." Obviously, that would not be something to do before the Security Council. Mr. President, if I made two preliminary points. I owe an apology to the prosecution. Indeed, the prosecution did ask for the person we both believe to be Tip. And if I'm correct, he is actually known also under a TCW number. It's 2 TCW 884. So the prosecution did ask for that person that we both believe is the Tip that Mr. Hinton spoke to. My second preliminary point is, good morning, Mr. Hinton, more directed to you. If it would be possible to speak a bit slower in answering questions, and also, if possible, a bit shorter, so that I don't lose that much time.
Mr. President, I don't want to interrupt, but the prosecution doesn't necessarily believe that this person, Teep, is the person in those 4 records of interview. The prosecution just doesn't know. we haven't had a chance to speak to this witness before he's testified. He could be, he may not be, but we don't have a belief, just so that's clear for the record.
No problem. Mr. Hinton, yesterday in the late afternoon we spoke about the three sources for your academic work and how they would relate to certain things, statements you made in your testimony yesterday. Before I return to the subject that we finished with yesterday, the speech of late King Father, let me ask you a few additional questions in relation to those three sources. First, a question which is sort of related to the matter of TEEP. You speak about a certain lore. I understand that maybe also at this point in time you do not know what the real name of lore is. Maybe you do because of your new book. But could lore be either Him Hui or possibly a person that Him Hui refers to as Teng? And I've read in Chandler that he refers to a conversation, transcript of a conversation that you had with a certain Q lore. I don't know if you are at liberty to answer this question, but I would appreciate if you could.
Again, because of human subjects protocols at the university, I would need to check with my university and also with the person who I refer to as lore. I'm aware in the S21 world is a fairly small world, so it may be fairly self-evident, but I'd also say that I've also, over the years, interviewed a number of people who worked at S21, and I've looked with specific reference to Him Hui, who you mentioned. I've looked at transcripts, I've observed his testimony, and so if you have questions, I'd be happy to do my best to answer those regarding him.
No, I don't have the time to actually go into depth in that subject, but would you be willing to write on a piece of paper whether lore is indeed one of those 2 or 3 people that I mentioned?
Just to be clear, the paper would have to go on the case file. That's what I tried yesterday. But
I understand, but that's a little bit less public than saying it so that everyone can hear.
Thank you, Mr. Co-Defense Lawyer. So again, in order to protect the human rights of the people with whom we do research, as part of the university protocol, we go through a series of questions with them, and we ask whether or not we can reveal who they are. My notes are back in the United States. He may have said, you can reveal my name. I don't know. I would need to go back there and look at my records. So while I do know very clearly who this individual is, I'm unable to say that until I check my records in order to protect his human rights.
Thank you. Now, something that we briefly discussed yesterday as well. I said that there were about 15 people that you spoke to, and you said no, there was about 100 people in that Banjan village. I went back to your book, and in the first pages of your book, there is a list of what you call personage. There are quite a few people that obviously you didn't speak to because they're dead, or they were in prison, so you couldn't speak to. But when you deduct the people who are dead, like Koitun or Un, the Division 310 commander, it's only a handful of individuals, it seems, that you spoke to. I count, there's Chilat, there's Kel, Lor, Nyari, Chan, Tip, Pek, Vien Kuen, Van Nat, and Vong. And then there are within the book a number of individuals which aren't really named. Let me give you a few examples. English ERN 00431710 till 11. There's no French or Khmer. There's a DK village head from the Banjan area. Then English ERN 00431711, there's a Banjan villager. And then there's the head of the Khmer Buddhist Society, the current government official. I can go on for a little bit, but it seems to me that ultimately more in-depth interviews were limited to between 10 and 20 people. Would that be correct to say?
Thank you, Mr. Co-defense lawyer. So the reference you have to the sort of key people who appear in the book, that was placed into the book to help the reader, and it refers to people who I talk about. So if they forget who the person is in reading, they'll be able to refer back to it. I should note that in doing so, in anthropology, we often have what are called key informants, who are experts who have more information. And those also tend to be the people you talk to and more do what are called in-depth interviews, multiple interviews with. So within the number of informants, there are different sorts of informants. You have everyday casual conversations as part of participant observation. You have interviews such as the survey where I went and talked to 100 people in the village. So again, there are about 100 households, 95, I don't know, you can check, it's in the book. I went to every single household and talked to someone there. So right off the bat in the first month of my research, I spoke to 100 people about their experiences. I talked to many people at the village. As you're doing participant observation, unlike a survey research, you don't go and check off. You live and become part of the life of the village and the experience of the people. And putting together a book, and this is true for the book I just completed on the Doig trial as well, you have literally, in the case of that book, I don't have a number offhand, but well over 100 interviews I was pulling upon in addition to participant observation. In fact, if you take the 95 that we just talked about, that's just the beginning of the study. I can't provide an explicit number, but I can assure you it's many, many different people I interacted with. And when you complete the book, you try and find representative voices or those people with whom you've done in-depth interviews who can shed light on the narrative that you're trying to convey. And the narrative for me was to represent the lived experience of the people of Banyan Village, their experience of what happened during the DK regime while unpacking the cultural dimensions of genocide. I should note, because it may not be clear, that I have my initial study that was done 1994 to 1995 as a graduate student doing ethnographic field work in Cambodia, but I also lived in Cambodia for a little bit in 1992, and as I said at the very beginning with Mr. President, I've returned to Cambodia since then repeatedly. Since then, I've interviewed hundreds of other people. So the body of knowledge about which I'm speaking draws upon interviews with an enormous number of individuals, an enormous number of survivors, a smaller number, as you pointed out, of actual DK cadres, some of whom, as you say, at the time I was doing my 1995 field work, it was difficult to find. Anyway, so the number of people I've spoken to is enormous, as probably is true with a handful of other scholars, external scholars who've worked in this area. In terms, and also, just to recognize the work that DCCAM has done as well. I've gone and looked at their archives and their material, and there's a massive amount of information there as well.
I'll get back to that point just in a bit. But let me maybe rephrase my question, because what we are dealing with here in this courtroom is mainly or predominantly your book. And we are trying to determine which, for us, verifiable sources you have been using for your book. I think we are all in possession of the scholarship that you have used, all the contemporaneous documents, I believe. What I'm trying to find out is what is the material that is uniquely coming from you, and maybe saying this, how many key informants, as you call them, did you talk to, you yourself, that formed the source, one of those three sources for this book?
Thank you, Mr. Co-Defense Lawyer. So again, the first month I arrived, I spoke to at least 95 people, many more. So within the village, I'm sure hundreds of people there. I believe the census was there were about 500 people.
Sorry to interrupt you, but I don't imagine that those 100 people are all key informants. Mm-hmm. Who are the ones that you consider key informants? How many?
Yeah. So again, this is so again, Mr. Defense Co-Lawyer. Maybe it's a bit difficult to convey ethnographic research because it's different perhaps than historical research, psychological research, sociological research, research of political scientists, people working with surveys. This is done over a long period in a given locality. In a sense, while if you want a quantitative, how many people did I interview multiple times, something like that, but it doesn't get to the heart of what anthropologists do, because that's one piece of a much broader undertaking. And again, to go back to my goal of trying to convey the lived experience of the people from this village while unpacking the cultural dimensions of genocide, that was my objective. So if you talk about just key informants, in a way, everyone is in a way, everyone's important, their experience is important. I talked to many people about their experiences. I selected a certain number of individuals to focus upon to present the narrative. There are perhaps half a dozen people I interviewed more than 2 or 3 times, but I don't want to say that I have 4 or 5 key interviews. I mean, I have many stories, reams of documentation, and I don't want to, maybe it's difficult because of the nature of anthropological research and the methods being distinct in terms of the lived experience part of it, in contrast to other disciplines. But again, so one answer is many, many different key informants, because I heard many stories, talked to many people. But in the book, I focus on a smaller number because this isn't a report, it's an analysis, and they're different undertakings.
I understand what you're saying, but I do hope you understand our perspective. We need somehow to be able, or to be in a position to verify the veracity of your sources, human sources, the reliability of those sources, whether they are in any way representative of the region. But I suppose, would you agree with me that that would not be possible for any of the parties, really, in this courtroom? If that is a yes, then I will move on.
Thank you, Mr. Co-Defense Lawyer. I don't think that I would say yes to that. As I mentioned yesterday, what I've found remarkable, even since I've been here, is the fact that this court has gathered an enormous amount of information including information from the Kampong Siem district, including down to Krala commune, that dovetails directly mirrors the experiences that I represent in my book. You have this individual who you think is Tiep, who conveys information that talks about the jam being and another person who the Office of the Co-Prosecutors mentioned yesterday, talk about taking jams out and executing them at Tul Bang. There's talk about Wapanam Pro, Panam Sarai. So I think an enormous amount of what I've said, regardless of the sources, is there before you on the record through these other interviews that have taken place. It's in the court record in a sense. So as I said before, I had to work through a method of triangulation as a graduate student. Again, this is in the period 1994 to 1995, where there were no cell phones. I drove around on a moped. I tried to track people down as best I could. And I'm glad to see that the information that I present in my book seems to have been largely accurate and supported by documents that are officially in the court record, including the destruction of the jams, which, again, we had a segment of that read out in court.
I apologize, but let me interrupt you again. You actually touched upon another problem. You seem to be continuously mixing your post-2004 book knowledge with whatever you have observed in this courtroom while observing the Duke trial. So that makes it very difficult for us to really focus on what your sources were for your book, which is in fact the basis of your being summoned as an expert. But let me move on to the third.
Sorry, can I try something actually to assist? Perhaps a matter of language. As lawyers, we have this tendency to be very precise. Yeah? So what counsel was trying to find out is actually a number, meaning I interviewed, 25 people in detail, but I talked to 350 more. Your answer is always things like, let me see, enormous number of people, very large number of people. This is, I guess, a different approach. Very large is different for me and you probably. So if it is possible, if you can just say so, perhaps you could give a number of the people and then explain, 25 with whom I did, and then please explain what you did with them. And another group of, with whom I interacted and got information. But numbers might help us a bit, if you can give them.
Thank you, Your Honor. So again, the research, perhaps I could ask for a point of clarification as well about whether I'm only supposed to speak about my knowledge based on this book, or if I'm supposed to speak more broadly about my expertise as a genocide scholar, as someone who has continued to interview and study this period of history. But I guess that would be, am I restrained to the period of 1994, 1995? I'm somewhat confused.
I would say we need precise questions that clarify that.
The reason we're here to see if we are able to somehow verify what you're saying. What we have on the case file is your book and numerous other articles. That is the basis. But when you're saying, I observed this in the Duke trial, I don't know exactly what you observed. So we need to pinpoint you to what we have on the case file, because that is the evidence which is available, and that is why I made that remark.
Did I understand you correctly to get somewhere? Yeah? Your last questions were pertaining to the book, to the sources for the book, or did I misunderstand?
No, that's correct.
So perhaps this is clarified. Can you give us numbers as to the sources exclusively for the book, used for the book?
Thank you, Your Honor, and thank you, Mr. Co-Defense Lawyer. So again, had I known before I came here that this information would be requested, I would have gone and systematically reviewed my records. I don't have my records with me. Some of the information is in the book. So with understanding that I can't tell you for sure because I would need to check systematically, I can give you some, guesses. I would say that if you talk about people who I spoke to for more than one interview, as sort of the beginning of it, there were probably at least 10 to 20 people who were in multiple interviews. If I talk about people who I interviewed once, as I said before, sat in their houses for half hour, sometimes more, 2 hours, depends on the person. So the first 95 households go off, and then many more after that. I would say there's got to be 150 to 200. I had conversations with people in Kampong Cham City. In other words, my research, for example, I did research on the education sector in Kampong Cham City, and I did interviews there as well. I did a variety of other types of research. So besides this one village, there were an enormous number of places where I did interviews, and then I went back to Phnom Penh and I interviewed some people who had formerly worked at S21. I think that at the time it was Lore, a couple of maybe at least one other person. I'd have to check my records as I did archival research. So I don't know if that provides a bit more guidance, but if we think of pools, there's this first smaller pool where there's more extensive interviewing, and then there's a much larger second pool where there's significant conversations that are taking place, but it's not repeated, extended interviews. And then outside of that, there's the much larger pool of everyday conversations that are taking place. But I think it's important, again, to emphasize, in contrast to other disciplines, where sometimes people come in with a survey, do an interview for an hour, go, take off, and leave. I was living amongst the people, and that part, in anthropology, participant observation is absolutely critical, as important as interviews.
I'm not sure if we get the answer that we might be looking for, but let me quote something that you've written yourself, so that maybe that might be helpful in understanding my question. And in one of your writings, that is E3/9703, on page 2, you noted that apart from the, and I quote you, inevitable methodological, tactical, and logistical problems that arise at every stage of data gathering, the difficulty of verifying the reliability of sources, evaluating statistics, and comparing official documents with the testimonies of eyewitnesses, genocide studies are further complicated by purely political considerations. Actually, I'm just, this is not something that you said yourself. You were quoted as having said that, I believe in, by the Ukraine Weekly, so I apologize for that. But that is exactly, I think, the problem that you might have signaled in relation to anthropological research, and the same problem that we have. Could you comment on that quote?
Thank you, Mr. Co-Defense Lawyer. So again, I don't have the text in front of me. I haven't reviewed the text. As is the case with all of us when we do interviews, they're sometimes selective. So again, I don't even know the year of this. So, but having said that, yesterday I spoke that absolutely when I was there from 1994 to 1995, it was a completely different situation in terms of doing field work. The Khmer Rouge, as I said, were active. There was a village, Romias, actually, where Uwan was from. And I should add, I also did research there and interviewed people there, where there were a lot of former Khmer Rouge, but there were also been massive purges of the people who had lived in the village because they were connected to Goi Tuan. At the time, the Khmer Rouge were still fighting. The civil war was ongoing. Documents had been destroyed by the elements. And so the way you had to proceed with information is the best you can to listen and talk to people, and then to confirm through the method of triangulation I mentioned, where you try and talk to people and see if a narrative emerges through that. Talk to the person who's being talked about. For example, in the case of Tiep, or the case of Kell, and then again see if you can put together a picture that makes sense. You know, now with the enormous amount of information that's available, and by and large, very much confirmation. You cited Michael Vickery's book as well, and he actually talks about Region 41 and the account that he provides based on his interviews with refugees. Actually parallels the account that I'm presenting, where he says that conditions there got worse in 1977 when the Southwest Cadre arrived. So I think there's an enormous amount of data that supports the account that I'm providing, including witness interviews that are on record with this court that very directly parallel what I found. So,
thank you, Mr. Hinton. I'll interrupt you again. I don't think I will get the answer that I'm looking for. So let me move now to the third source, your study or review of the original documents. I did a search in your book, in your footnotes, and I believe, if I'm not mistaken, that I counted a total of 44 documents that you have used. They are divided into 4 or 5 categories. About 8 FIBIS reports. FIBIS is the U.S. Foreign Broadcast Information Services. About 7 confessions. About 6 revolutionary flags. About 4 or 5 DK documents, such as decisions of the Central Committee. Some documents that are in the Cornell microfilm reel, confessions and some other material, and about 7 or 8 DC Cam documents. Would that be an accurate count of the documents that you have used in addition to the scholarship that existed when you wrote your book, and in addition to those interviews that you took?
Thank you, Mr. Co-Defense Lawyer. Again, without going back and looking, I can't verify, but you seem to have done a count. You've given an interpretation of the sources. It sounds broadly correct. I can't tell, but I think more to the point is, again, as with key informants and with people you talk to in the village, when you write something, you can't put everything into the text. So the number, for example, I think the Phoebus documents were much more available. I looked at far more Phoebus documents, as is evident from earlier discussions, the documents that were presented before. There's an enormous amount of repetition in the discursive rhetoric in CPK documents. There's a lot of repetition. So I think you could pull in dozens and dozens of different documents, but I'm sure I reviewed more documents than ended up in the footnotes. And part of the reason I condensed it down is because, you know, publishers are concerned about the length of a book and actually don't want you to pack too much in. And it's repetitive. So I would say that, again, the number of documents I referred to was a broader pool, especially with the Phoebus broadcasts, which were more available.
I understand, but I believe in your dissertation you don't really use additional documents. Obviously in your dissertation you are supposed to list all the sources. But let me move on because I don't have that much time. 1 or 2 additional questions in respect of the documents. You are using confessions of people detained in S-21. Now at this court it is strictly forbidden to use any of the content of these S-21 confessions. What is it that you did in terms of reliability to nevertheless use those S-21 confessions to come to certain conclusions?
Thank you, Mr. Co-Defense Lawyer. So again, at the time I was writing, I was aware that the confessions couldn't be looked at as fact in any manner. One of the primary things I wanted to do, and again, it's hard to imagine now because of the databases that exist. So in terms of finding REIP, RACIM, I didn't have a computer I could go and punch in a number to. I had to go to the Tuol Sleng Museum, and I asked them. They didn't know where his confession was. Spent an enormous amount of time trying to find his confession. Again, there's no automated system. Finally, I found it. But you know, in this case, and this was one of the main reasons I went there, is people had talked a lot about Goi Tuan, and this being part of the Goi Tuan network, but also the experience of REIP, who had run Wat Phnom Pro Phnom Sarai, was very significant to this village. So I wanted to trace out and find the person because there was a story that he had actually tried to rebel at one point and had detonated some explosives and had failed to do so. And I was also curious to look at his confession as part of this larger story. But the story of that detonation, as I say, came from, in part, Kel, who told it to me, and then seemed to be confirmed in some form or another by the confession. But I was also, in terms of exploring the cultural dimensions of genocide, as I said before, interested in the structure of the confessions, the way that they reflected patronage networks, right, relationships of dependency, and as well as the way the narratives were constructed so that they were an inversion of revolutionary histories. And so I didn't really rely on the content of the confessions to draw a narrative. I looked at structural factors and, you know, again, the fact that REIP confessed to having had these detonating these explosives resonated with what Kel had told me. And so in terms of the method of triangulation, that again is, to me, suggests an affirmation of what he's saying, because Kel has absolutely no way of knowing what happened to REIP. And in fact, he had no idea where he went.
So would you, sorry to interrupt, would you then agree with Chandler in his turn citing Heather, that under certain circumstances these confessions do have a certain probative value or reliability to them?
Thank you, Mr. Co-Defense Lawyer. Again, I wouldn't want to make a broad, sweeping statement, but for my purposes, maybe I can answer that given my objectives and what I want to do and understand from the confessions, it had value in terms of revealing that the structure of patronage relationships that exist and structure social relations in Cambodia on many levels were operative and were reflected by the confessions and were part of the way that the people at S21 were thinking in terms of the way they were purging networks, and the language that was used dovetailed with the language that was used by people on the ground. So again, this is part of the process of triangulation that we're doing. But as again, when I was doing the research in 1994, 95, it's a completely different experience. And it's hard to convey how hard it was to get things like find a confession where now you just punch in an ERN number and it appears on the screen. It took days of work.
Then one additional question to the use of documents. I've noted that you didn't use DC Chem interviews of people who might have been in a position to say certain things about rebellions in the North Zone, rebellions led by Un, you mentioned often in your book. Is that a correct assessment, that you didn't use any DC Chem statements, DC Chem interviews of people?
Thank you, Mr. Co-Defense Lawyer. So again, at the time, 1994 to 1995, I believe the Yale Cambodian Genocide Project had gotten underway, and I believe, I can't remember the year that DCCAM became an independent, non-governmental organization. It may be 1997. You'll have to check the record. I can't tell you for sure. So if we're talking about the period when I was doing my research, 1994 to 1995, It was very difficult to even find the DCCAM office because I think they experienced, well, you have to check.
Let me interrupt you there. Your book is, I think the manuscript was finished in 2004. So I'm not referring to your work in 1994, but I'm referring to your work finished in 2004, 2005. Is it correct that you didn't use any DCCAM statements of individuals, DCCAM interviews?
Thank you, Mr. Co-Defense Lawyer. So, again, I was trying to stick to the period that you wanted me to speak about, which is 1994 to 1995, but maybe it would help if I elaborate on the process of writing the book and how it came to be and the sequence, which maybe will clarify some of the confusion. Okay, so I did the initial field work from 1994 to 1995. I returned to my university. In 1997, my dissertation was published. I didn't return to Cambodia until 2000. In 2000, as I began the process of revising my dissertation into book form, in 2000 I did do research at DCCAM, I believe, for looking primarily, if I recall correctly, at confessions and DK documents. For example, I believe that's when I found Lohr's life history, his biography that's included in my book. And if I remember correctly, I came back in 2003. But in academic books, you have a period of peer review that takes place. That peer review process can take up to a year. I can't remember how long, because you get evaluations, and then you revise the manuscript based on the evaluation of your peers. So actually, the book manuscript was probably completed maybe in 2002, began peer review. Once a book is completed, after peer review, it's been accepted. It takes an entire year for it to come out. So the book, to say it's finished in 2004 isn't accurate. It actually was done earlier and then underwent this period of peer review. I came back in 2000. I'm sure I reviewed DCCAM, but for example, their magazine Searching for the Truth, I believe, began in 2000. You may remember better than me. So again, the amount of documentation that they had, that now if you go to their office, you go to the public information room, you can procure documents very quickly. But this was the early phase, and things were much harder then. And again, it's hard to convey the experience of doing research. It was very different. So I didn't, because of the historical moment in which I was working at DCCAM, that documentation was not as readily available to me. Since then, I've looked at many issues of Searching for the Truth, and I've returned, at different times to their archives, as well as consulted many other sources and interviewed many other people.
Thank you. I'll move on now, Mr. Hinton, to the subject that we left, we didn't finish yesterday, and that is the qualification of the word yun, or its meaning, etc. Yesterday I tried to elicit an answer from you in relation to late King Father's speech, King Father Sihanouk's speech before the UN Security Council. You declined to answer because you first wanted to read beforehand, I think, what he actually said. I hope you were in a position last night or this morning to have a look at that speech. And I would like now to read a few excerpts of that speech and then ask your comments, especially in relation to Vietnam or the Vietnamese being called land-swallowing aggressors. Mr. President, I believe there is still no Khmer or French translation of it. I only have the English text, so I will read it very slowly. It is a document, as we discussed before, E3/7335. And I'll be reading a few paragraphs from his very long speech. I will start with paragraph 75. Just for Judge Lavergne, I just got a note from my team that the speech is available in French in an accepted video on the case file as E3/7336R. Um, for the background, Mr. President, I'm reading from the Security Council official records. The 2108th meeting in January 1979. So here is, originally in French, late King Father Sihanouk addressing the Security Council. Paragraph 75. But on the very morrow of the final victory in April 75, a victory over imperialism, and in the wake of the reunification of the two Vietnams, North and South, the Socialist Republic of Vietnam decided, cold-bloodedly, to embark upon a very special operation whose ultimate goal was nothing less than to swallow up little Kampuchea, just as a starving boa constrictor would fling itself upon an innocent animal. Paragraph 78. My saying what I have just said about Vietnam does not constitute interference in the internal affairs of that country. There is a necessity which makes it my duty to create a better understanding of the reasons why my country has always had to put up with acts of aggression and other armed attacks from Vietnam, which have been going on since the 15th century. From the 15th to the beginning of the 20th century, Vietnam, in spite of the bitter and indomitable resistance of the army and people of Kampuchea, succeeded in swallowing up a good half of Kampuchea. That half became what is known today as South Vietnam. It used to be the south of Kampuchea. Paragraph 79. Although this is inconceivable in the 1970s, when all the talk is of respect for the Charter of the United Nations and the just principles of non-alignment, the Socialist Republic of Vietnam, a member moreover of the United Nations and a full-fledged member of the family of non-aligned countries, is not embarrassed by any scruples. Greatly encouraged by its multiform alliance, in particular a de facto military alliance with the USSR, one of the two world superpowers, drawing comfort from the total and unconditional support accorded by it to the powers of the Warsaw Pact, with the exception of Romania. Here it comes, respecting the good old traditions of shamelessly swallowing up small neighbors whenever the opportunity presents itself, and motivated also, we must point out, by the keen appetite that it had nurtured for many years, the Socialist Republic of Vietnam came to the point of launching an all-out attack with all the power of its Hitlerite armed forces for the conquest of Kampuchea. The irresistible advance of a host of armored tanks and cars, accompanied by a dozen infantry divisions, supported by the most modern heavy artillery, preceded and protected by innumerable aircraft of all types, including MiG-21s and some MiG-23s. That advance, a veritable German-style blitzkrieg in nature, strangely reminds us of the blitzkrieg of the Hitlerite armed forces to which so many European countries, France and Poland in particular, fell victim at the beginning of the Second World War. And finally, paragraphs 83, 84, and 85, small paragraphs. 83. In the face of the insolent claim on the part of the Socialist Republic of Vietnam to the effect that the war that is raging in Kampuchea or Cambodia is only a civil war without any Vietnamese involvement, the Kampuchean people, through me, has the honor of asserting vigorously that this war is purely a war of aggression, annexation, colonization, and regional hegemonism unilaterally, arbitrarily, and unjustly unleashed by the Socialist Republic of Vietnam against Little Kampuchea. The so-called United Front for the National Salvation of Kampuchea and its government are, in fact, only a pitiful smokescreen designed to hide from the outside world the criminal and repugnant anti-Kampuchean undertaking of the Socialist Republic of Vietnam, which shows its contempt of other sovereign countries and peoples of the world by feeding them such obvious lies that even a child cannot give them any credence. And finally, Mr. Hinton, paragraph 85, those countries which have hastened to accord de jure recognition of the government of Heng Samrin, the pitiful puppet of the Vietnamese, expose themselves as the intimate accomplices that they are of the Socialist Republic of Vietnam in its current attempt to annihilate independent, sovereign, neutral, and non-aligned Kampuchea. End of a very long quote. I apologize for that, Mr. Hinton. In relation to our discussion yesterday, are you now able, or do you now feel free to give a reaction to late King Father Sihanouk's speech in terms of Vietnam as the enemy in all the relation to all the things that he talks about Vietnam?
Thank you, Mr. Co-Defense Lawyer. First, I'd just like to take a moment to pay my respects to the deceased late Father King. I'd also like to acknowledge his suffering and the fact that he lost many family members. I remember seeing a movie about Cambodia. I believe it was the movie that came out about Cambodian rock and roll, where there's a clip of him sobbing when he talks about the death of his family members during democratic Kampuchea. I should recall that I believe, you can correct me if I'm wrong, that at this time he's written about being under the control and being minded by Khmer Rouge as well. You know, it could be wrong, but I believe at this time, immediately afterwards, he still has written about being under the control of the Khmer Rouge and talked about it as an extremely coercive experience. Having said that, I would note first that the late Father King Father does not use the word Yuan. In that sense, it seems, you know, our discussion yesterday was about the racist connotations of the word Yuan. I think in terms of thinking about the process of manufacturing difference that I talked about before, there's like a first instantiation of it as the crystallization of difference, where you pay attention to other groups and you sharpen what are otherwise more fluid distinctions. Of course, in the context of democratic Kampuchea, the immediate aftermath, this was very much a distinction that was in everybody's minds. This is clear from the passage you read. If we talk to the point at which we began yesterday about whether discourses using the word Yuan that are in a context that are much stronger and promote and incite potential violence, such as the one we have many examples. Up until today, we have implemented 1 against 30, meaning we lose 1, the UN lose 30. So then our losses are 30 times fewer than those of the UN. This was read in court. I don't think I need to read it again. But if you, but could I please finish? If you take the context of a speech like that, the DK, the speech from DK that I just read that was introduced as evidence, and you take that and you compare it to the words of the late King Father that were given immediately after the fall of the DK regime, while he was under the coercive pressure of the Khmer Rouge at the time, it seems to me vastly different. And so I would say that the rhetorics that are expressed, for example, in much DK discourse, such as this one, are of high level of incitement towards violence, and that it's not accurate to compare a speech given by the late King Father to compare the two. I mean, I could continue to read this, you could read that, and they're completely different. The one point of similarity, which you point out, is that, as I mentioned yesterday, there are a set of stereotypes that exist. If you talk to people about the legend of the Master's Tea, people know that. So there are a set of understandings that become at different points in time to be mobilized in different sorts of ways. But the point that comes from our discussion of the use of the term Yuan in the context of DK is that this is a time where you have discourse that's vehement, it's strong, and it's a form of racist incitement. And I don't think it's appropriate to try and draw a parallel between what the late King Father said and what is said in a broadcast like that.
Let me move away from the word Yuan. Are you saying that when he gave that speech before the Security Council, he was pressurized, under pressure to say these words? And if that is indeed your opinion, how would you then explain similar words he said in his press conference in Beijing just before this, and his subsequent support of the CPK and the DK regime the 10 subsequent years when DK was still holding its seat in the UN?
Thank you, Mr. Co-Defense Lawyer. Very briefly, I think that if you want clarification on this point, you should speak to perhaps the royal biographer of the late King Father, Hula Heldres, who talked to him extensively. But I think the point to me is, if you take the words that you read and you compare those to the text I read, they are completely different, even if there are similarities, small similarities, in terms of the mobilization of metaphors. As I said from the very beginning, even the use of the word Yuan can be used in a banal, everyday manner, but it's when it's recruited.
I apologize, I have to interrupt you. You're circumventing, I believe, the answer to my question. My question is it your opinion that he was somehow under pressure to utter these words, the words of aggression, land swallowing, that they were put in his mouth, and if he didn't, then something would happen? Is that your testimony?
Thank you, Mr. Co-Defense Lawyer, and I understand your concern for clarification. Perhaps I should say that the basis of what I said comes from having read his memoirs a while ago, from some knowledge of the history, but that to be certain and to get an expert informed opinion, you should ask someone like Julio Heldres, who is his biographer, had numerous conversations with him. But that, based on my knowledge, is the answer that I would provide. So I can't provide you with a certain answer because I never had the honor of meeting and speaking with the King Father.
Let us move away for a while from the late King Father's speech. Are you in a position to give your opinion as to what, for instance, in the United States, an important scholar was testifying about to U.S. Congress about these ambitions that Vietnam had and referred to by late King Father? What was the scholarly view in the United States in 1978 and before about Vietnam's ambitions toward Cambodia?
Thank you, Mr. Co-Defense Lawyer. I think that in order to be specific, I would need a specific reference and text. Again, I reviewed the documents primarily relating to the DK period. There are many documents I was given to review, more than I could possibly read. So it's not fresh. I'm not sure what you're speaking about. So if you could read from a document, I can let you know if I feel qualified to offer an opinion in that regard.
I'm happy to be more specific to guide you a bit. I'm now referring, Mr. President, to document E3/2370. It is a report written by, I believe at that time, one of the most eminent scholars on Vietnam's policy, Douglas Pike, foreign State Department officer and scholar as well. And on page 17 of that document, English ERN 00187396 and French 00344747 and 48, he says the following, and he's testifying or giving his expert opinion to U.S. Congress in, I believe, October 78. He says, and I quote, Vietnamese communists long have regarded a federation of Indochina as the proper ultimate political configuration for the peninsula. Of necessity, this would require Cambodian and Laotian acquiescence, or at least find rulers in the two countries who are amenable to the idea. In creating a federation of Indochina, the Vietnamese are in no hurry. A little bit further, Cambodian behavior in the war is not as irrational as appears. There is logic both to Cambodian strategy and rhetoric, particularly when viewed in the light of Cambodian history. I've helped you a bit. Can you react on what Douglas Pike is saying to U.S. Congress in October 78?
Thank you, Mr. Co-Defense Lawyer. I am aware of that report. I read it many, many years ago. It's not fresh, but I can go based on what you said. I think, again, I would agree that if you look at the position of the leaders of DK, and I think I'm answering more broadly, I think that there absolutely is a logic to what they're saying, and to portray them as irrational is not accurate. Whether that logic reflects historical reality is another question, but I think it would certainly be a mistake to simply dismiss what's being said about, for example, the intentions of Vietnam. At the same time, it's important to know that acknowledging that there's a logic, again, does not mean that that logic is historically accurate. And I think it's important in trying to understand DK to understand the way that the leaders felt and the way they perceived relations in terms of Vietnam. I think that's all very important. But again, to say there's a logic does not mean that it's historical truth. That needs to be evaluated.
Now I'm a bit puzzled. I would argue that Douglas Pike was very clairvoyant because 3 months before Vietnam's invasion and 10-year occupation, he sort of predicted what actually happened. So isn't his testimony a reflection of what was about to be happening only 3 months later?
Thank you, Mr. Co-Defense Lawyer. I don't know him, but I think probably given the escalating conflict between Democratic Kampuchea and Vietnam at the time, the buildup of troops, and I assume there was intelligence that saw this, and I think a number of people, I would have to go back and look, for example, at Nyan Chanda's reports. He has testimony on record here that may affirm it, that I don't think it was probably a surprise to that many people when the Vietnamese-backed army came in to Phnom Penh a few months later. So is it surprising? I don't think probably it's all that surprising. Probably it's just based on intelligence that was pretty evident to people at the time, given the conflict that was taking place, and I would say probably newspaper reporting as well.
Well, I sincerely doubt that, Mr. Hinton, because both Richard Dutman and Elizabeth Becker were informed by the State Department that they didn't think an invasion was about to happen. But leaving that aside, do you know anything about how, not scholars, but how the United States itself viewed Vietnam's ambitions? More particularly, do you know how President Ford and Secretary of State Kissinger viewed the Vietnamese ambitions, let's say, November '75?
Mr. Expert, please hold on, and Deputy Co-Prosecutor, you have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. President. I'm not sure whether this is within this witness's area of expertise in relation to the foreign policy of the United States at the time. I mean, he may feel comfortable in answering the question, but it seems to be moving away from his testimony. It's just an observation at this stage.
I believe Mr. Hinton has offered all kinds of expertise, from the political science to history to you name it. So maybe he does know something. Let's ask him, and if he doesn't, then we'll find out.
And Mr. Expert, you can respond to that question. You may. If not, that is fine, because it seems to be a little bit stray out of the scope of having you as an expert on anthropology in particular.
I don't feel at the moment. Thank you, Your Honor. Thank you, Mr. Co-Defense Lawyer. Maybe you could elaborate a little bit on what you're thinking, because I find the question still is a little bit diffuse, and I'd be interested to hear what you think about this. But I can't really, based on the question, I'm not quite sure if I can answer it even. So I think if you could provide more information about what you're thinking and maybe refer to a specific passage of some sort, I could do my best if it's within my competence.
Maybe also, Mr. President, would be a good moment to break and allow also the other parties to review the page of a document that I'm referring to, which is on the case file, however, is not on the list. And it is something the defense big friend Ben Keenan wrote, and it is, I will give the ERN so that maybe parties can have a look at it, and then I can come back to it. It's document D269/5.1, English ERN 004-88244. It is an article in Ben Keenan's book, Genocide and Resistance in Southeast Asia. It's page 105 from the book, and it talks about President Suharto's visit to Ford and Kissinger, where they discuss Vietnam's ambitions, more particularly in November '75.
President, thank you, Counsel. And also, Mr. Professor, you may refer to that document during the break time so that you may respond to the defense question later. Let me have a short break now, and we will resume at 25-11. Court officer, please assist the expert during the break time and invite him back into the courtroom at 25-11. The court is now in recess.